we hear you read. I am hoping that you will share with everyone who's here today what you're reading, so we can kind of steal ideas to add books to our summer to read lists.
Well, I maybe kind of foolishly decided that this was going to be the year that I read Proust in its entirety. So I'm 5 volumes in. I have 1 volume to go, and it's surprisingly funny. It's with some exceptions in volume 5. It's not the slog I expected it to be. So it was kind of refreshing to discover that. I also recently finished Silmi Abdullah's lovely book, Home of the Floating Lily, which I won on Junction Reads when she was here. And I'm starting to work my way through some of the other Leacock Prize longlisters. So I started with a book called The List of Last Chances by Christina Myers, which I'm just barely into at this point.
Nice. That I'm interested in Proust because it's one of those books like War and Peace and The Idiot that has long been on the shelves, and so I'd be interested to talk to you about that afterwards, after you've gone through it, if you end up getting through it all in one go.
Well, I only have about 500 pages left out of 3,700, so I think I have to see it through now.
Right. Okay, so before we hear you read, is it okay if I share with everyone your biography?
Please.
R Wilson's debut novel, An Idea About My Dead Uncle, received the inaugural Guernica Prize for an unpublished manuscript in 2018. He holds a Bachelor of Music degree in Theory and Composition from the University of Calgary. He lives with his wife and daughter in Toronto, where he is working on another book about the main character in Call Me Stan, his second novel. You can find out more at www.krwilson.ca, and you can find him on Instagram and Twitter at krwbooks. Kevin, I'm thrilled to hear you read from Call Me Stan.
Well, thanks, Allison. I'm going to start with the opening, just because it sort of sets the table for the rest of the book. It's in the first person in the voice of Stan, and you'll get to know who he is from this section. Wandering Jew is a misnomer. I'm a Hittite, or I was when there was such a thing. Call me Stan. Hittite is a misnomer too. We were the Hatti. But then somebody mixed us up with that Canaanite hill tribe in the King James Bible, and we've been wearing the wrong name ever since. Names. They're so malleable. I was originally called Ishtanu, after one of our sun gods. We had a lot of gods. Some were ours, some co-opted from our vassals. We had a lot of vassals. My life started out like any other Bronze Age teenagers, shepherding, arranged marriage, military draft. It got more complicated when I realized I didn't die. It got a lot more complicated when other people realized it. Pre-modern society may have embraced a lot of theoretical immortals, but it wasn't all that tolerant of actual immortality. Modern society isn't noticeably better. I cope by changing identities every 20 years or so. That creates its own complications. You think you have trouble keeping track of your online passwords? Try keeping track over thousands of years of which name you're using for each eye blink of your life. I try to keep a common element. I've been Dristan, Constantius, Constanza, you get the idea. Sometimes I can't, so I've also been Olaf, Gestas, Jagdish. I was even Ishmael for a while, but don't call me that. Yes, Constanza and Anastasia and Betty. Don't look so puzzled. Change identities often enough, and after a while you want to mix it up. Just give me a good razor or a dab of hot wax. I've done it for decades at a time. Eventually, it's not just the appearance you want to mix up. With the endless scope of human mating options, would you settle for a steady diet of the same thing, century after century? Please. So when you live as long as I have, you eventually try pretty much everything. I've been warrior and pacifist, ascetic and hedonist, thinker and doer, oppressed and oppressor. I've spied and been spied on, betrayed and been betrayed, killed and been, well, people have tried to kill me. Sometimes they thought they had, but here I am. I know that look. I've seen it before, wondering whether I'm genuinely delusional or just a really brazen liar. Setting up an insanity defense, maybe. But there's another possibility you shouldn't discount so easily. I might be telling the truth. Which is it? You're the detective. You figure it out. So that's the opening. I think that will give you a bit of a sense of Stan, maybe even a touch of his sense of humor. I think you'll get a little more of that from this next section. There's a debunked notion that the Norse gods were based on human refugees from the fall of Troy. But even though it's been debunked, I just found that too delicious not to run with, just to seize with both hands and run with in this book. So Stan is traveling with some of these refugees through what isn't at the time yet Europe. And they've conquered and taken over a tin mining town. Tin is an extremely valuable commodity at the time because it's an essential ingredient in bronze. And we're talking about the Bronze Age. So if you find a place where you can get tin, you tend to want to hang on to it. There's a character called Tror, which is a name from the Icelandic Edda that this debunked notion comes from. If you don't recognize him from the similarity of the name to begin with, you'll probably recognize him by the end of this section. They're having trouble with what seems to be losses in their tin production. We need to keep better track of how much there is at each stage. Then if some goes missing, we'll know where and when and who could have taken it. So first we need a way to measure the amounts. Then we need someone who can remember them. Do we have anyone we can trust with that? I have a more reliable way. I'd had the woodworkers make a shallow box, which I'd filled with clay. Tror sniffed. That looks like one of Woden's drawing toys. It is, kind of, but this one is for writing. I had to use the haughty word. The concept didn't exist in Thracian. What does that mean? I'll show you. I'd trimmed a reed into a stylus. Give me some numbers of things. What kinds of things? Anything. Boots, chickens, the more the better. Make the numbers as mixed up as you can. You mean like 6 pairs of boots, 21 cups of beans, that kind of thing? Exactly. I noted both in haughty cuneiform. More, as many as you like. 411 arrowheads. Good. Into the clay they went. 58 mares. Keep going. We ended up with a list of 20 things, no two the same quantity. All right, I said, tucking my stylus behind my ear. Let me read that back. By the end of the list, Tror's eyes were practically bugging out of his head. These marks tell you everything I said? Yes. But how can they do that? A lot of men can do this where I come from. We learn it so we can keep track of things, like we can do with the oar now. I can teach you if you like. No. He took a step back. This is a strange power. I don't like it. It is beyond my understanding. It occurred to me that if Tror got creeped out by everything beyond his understanding, he'd never get out from under his blanket. I understand things, Ishtanu. Things I can hold or throw or crush. But marks that mean things? He shook his head with a shudder, as if the very idea of abstract representation might already have infected him through his eyes. Which it kind of had, as it turned out. A pleasant sensation spread through me. Tror was scared. For him, the written word was a kind of magic, a power he didn't understand and couldn't control, and more importantly, didn't want to, because he'd grown up singing tales that told him strange powers always came with a horrible cost. He looked at me warily. But if you're okay using them, I restrained a chuckle. There it was. Tror was fine with taking the benefit of this strange power, as long as the cost fell to someone else. "Make me a war hammer," Tror said a few days later. "What's wrong with your axe?" "It's too clean. It slices." Like slicing was a defect in an axe. "I want a weapon that crushes." He smiled to himself. "In fact, that'll be its name, Crusher." He glared at me. "Make it." I made a model hammerhead out of wax. It would be a one-off, so I wouldn't need a reusable mold. When I showed him the mold, he frowned. "Too small." I'd scaled it up from the largest war hammer I'd seen. My hand barely covered it, but if Tror wanted something bigger, then fine. I made another model, half again as long. "Still too small." He drew a rough rectangle in the dirt with his finger. "This big." It was the size of my forearm. It was preposterous. I didn't know if it was possible to cast something that big. "That'll take enough bronze to make 500 arrowheads or a dozen axes. It'll be too heavy to lift." "Never mind how much bronze it takes. We have plenty. And let me worry about lifting it." This time he was satisfied with the model. "Right, I'll cast the mold." I started toward the path to the clay pits. "Wait." "Oh gods, what now?" I turned back. "You know those marks you make? The ones that mean things?" "Yes." "Put some on the hammer. Its name, Crusher, and words of power, calling down the aid of the gods, that sort of thing, all over it." Tror had found the magic of the written word too hard to resist. "Will do." By the time I gave the model to the potters, it was covered in cuneiform. Across the top, I'd put Crusher, as I'd said I would. The rest I don't remember exactly, but instead of invoking the gods, I'd decided to have some fun. After all, I was the only one who knew what any of it meant. So it was mostly stuff like, "If you think I'm a huge tool, you should meet the guy who wields me," that sort of thing. Tror loved it. "And this one? A traditional invocation to the Hittite storm gods." If I remember it right, it was actually an unflattering description of Trour's backside. "This will do nicely. Have the clay workers make the mold." If archaeologists ever recover that hammer from the bottom of the North Sea, they're going to go batshit over those inscriptions.
I love that. I love what that scene made me think about is what we talked about earlier and what you say in your acknowledgements about history, and that historical fiction or history is historical fiction. I'm gonna look at my notes. That even the weird kind necessarily depends on the work of actual historians, but this scene and a couple of other ones and what you've said about Thor got me thinking about the recording of history and how much of it in and of itself is fiction, and that's been talked about by historians for decades. But when you were sitting down, or centuries, when you were sitting down to write the history in Call Me Stan and the fictional history in Call Me Stan, how did you know what to keep historically and what to make up?
Well, that's the big thing, isn't it? I've seen it said that Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote the Broadway musical Hamilton, made the point. He took a, I don't know, 600 or 800 page biography of Alexander Hamilton and boiled it down into a conventional length Broadway musical. And he's made the point, a huge part of what you're doing is deciding what to leave out.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've tended to do, I'll get one sort of main secondary source about the period that I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll mark it up with margin lines and asterisks and dog-eared pages. Pulling out the bits that I find interesting.
Yeah.
And then I'll summarize, or in some cases, quote whole passages in a document. And as I'm going through that exercise, I'm thinking about, okay, I'm not just writing history though. This is about Stan. So where will Stan best fit into all of this? And then I use that document as the document where I start writing the story. So below where I'm writing will be all of the notes that I've made in the document along the way, and page references back to the source I used. And depending on how Stan wants his story to be told, sometimes I'll end up throwing away some of those notes because things I found interesting don't necessarily end up being things that serve the narrative as the narrative starts to unfold.
Yeah. And if you're doing all of that research, that's kind of, it's almost like when you bring history into a fiction, it existed in your head already, you know, just a memory from your past or something that you read at one point in time. So it strikes me that if you've done all that research, it's kind of it lives in your head. And so when you're writing Stan's story, it just kind of comes out, or the pieces come out as needed.
Yeah, I've often found, kind of picking up on that, if I've read, a whole 300-400 page book on this particular part of history, and then I'm starting to write the narrative, stuff that I didn't put down as notes, stuff that I didn't even necessarily think was important or interesting or useful, will suddenly find a place in the narrative, and I'll remember it or quickly be able to find it because I didn't just cherry pick the book from the beginning. I did read the whole book.
Yeah. And I felt that way about music. And even though there's a huge musical theme throughout, like Ishtanu, learning music, learning instruments, becoming an opera singer, all of that music exists in the book. But what I felt when we got to the real stuff with Germany and Richard Wagner and everyone who lived in that sort of booming time of the opera and music, I felt when I was reading that I was reading what you knew, and that Ishtanu was kind of living in a world that was so written with such familiarity that I really felt like I was in Berlin. I was in that time and space. How did you know, as a person who holds a degree in music and in theory and composition, how did you know what music was going to come to Call Me Stan?
Well, the germ that Stan grew out of was this weird disconnect that Wagner was such a vile anti-Semite, but was also fascinated with the Buddha. I felt I wanted to write something about that for a long time, something I learned about when I was in undergrad doing my music degree. But I had no idea what I wanted to do with it or what I would write. And there's a science fiction writer, Stephen R. Donaldson, who in an afterword to one of his books says, and I'm wildly paraphrasing now, but he says, sometimes you'll have an idea and you just won't know what to do with it until another idea intersects with it. And then those two things kind of energize one another. And for me, that second idea was this legend of the so-called wandering Jew. Because then I had a narrator who, the book, the idea of what the book could be then expanded in both directions, because I had a narrator who could cover such a huge swath of history. At that point, I really just had that germ, the Wagner and Buddhism, and I had to do the research. I'm not a Wagnerian. I am not particularly a fan of Wagner's music, with or without his anti-Semitism.
Right.
So there's a bit of an irony that I ended up writing so many words about him. But I didn't even know when it was that he contemplated writing an opera about the Buddha, or when he became aware of the Buddha. So I had to look into that. I ended up finding a couple of really useful, well, 3 really useful books. There's a book called The Tristan Cord, Wagner and Philosophy, which explores mainly his fascination with Schopenhauer. There's a book called Wagner and Buddhism, I think that's what it's called, by a fellow named Urs App, that focuses just on that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the setting, I ended up coming upon a book called Richard Wagner, The Muse of Place, I think, which is specifically just about Wagner's time in Zurich, which was, as it turned out, where he was when he first found out about the Buddha and became fascinated with him, and had this notion that he might want to write an opera about him. So that made it fairly easy for me to know how music would play into that.
Mm-hmm.
I did figure I wanted to have, Wagner did conduct a lot of concerts and some operas when he was in Zurich, and I wanted to work that into the narrative. And originally I was thinking about using a production of Tannhäuser that he conducted. And I don't know why it took me so long to get there, but I realized eventually that he also conducted staging of The Flying Dutchman, who is a cursed immortal.
Right.
So that obviously was a very good fit, given who Ishtanu was. I didn't even know Ishtanu was Ishtanu at that point. That was sort of a third idea intersecting. I'm just kind of have been fascinated by, but had never really looked into the Norse gods. And I found a really interesting book about them, where I got this notion that Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic warlord / poet, whose writings we get most of what we know about Norse mythology from,
Mm-hmm.
was a Christian, but writing about the Norse gods. And so I think in an effort to make these stories acceptable to Christians,
Right.
he came up with this notion that these were really just heroic refugees from Troy. Okay, if I'm going to run with that,
Yeah.
let me see who else was around in the neighborhood at the time of the Trojan War. Oh, look, there's this huge Hittite empire.
Right.
Maybe my character can be a Hittite, and grew from there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What I loved about the scenes, I thought it was Berlin, but now you're saying Zurich, and I'm thinking, okay, I get
Yeah, I have a friend who says it's Vienna all the time. It's
right. That it's one of the most modern eras in the book that's really expanded. And what I loved about Ishtanu in those scenes is that it really does show how we've evolved away from tolerance. Like Ishtanu as a character, being 1,000 years old, has lived through the birth of a number of religions, and as a result of seeing the birth of all of those religions, has become quite a tolerant person. And then in thinking about religion, which I do a lot because of how I was raised, and death, I started thinking, it really feels like death is the reason why religion exists. And I wanted to talk to you about that, because it's like the idea of the afterlife, and when he meets when he's introduced to Hinduism, he starts thinking about his own immortality and what death means, and is told that death is just a beginning. And that really got me thinking about how religion and death play together. What can you talk about that?
Well, I figured if I had a character who was going to live from 1200 BC until now,
Yeah.
His worldview would probably undergo a lot of transformations over that period. So I made a real effort to show the development of that worldview and to make it his actual worldview in his narrative voice in each of the sections. So when he's in the Hittite army and they've come back from this battle with Egypt at Kadesh in what is now Syria, it's early enough in the book that probably isn't very spoilery, but he's been badly injured and he thinks he's going to die because he doesn't yet know he's immortal. And he's praying to Hittite gods. And he has dreams about his mother who died in childbirth, and consistent with the beliefs of the time, feels as though the dreams are his mother communicating with him. Then as the book evolves, I didn't want to make it, overtly a tour of Western philosophy, but I wanted that to be kind of a connecting thread throughout it. So, we have him traveling with Jesus, or Yeshu, in the way he tells the story, and he doesn't know at that point what
who he's going to be.
Yeshu will become to the world. And what I wanted to do was talk about some of the things that the Bible characterizes as miracles in a way that provide, history and myth and legend, they all tend to inflate things. So I thought, okay, what could the nuts and bolts, logical from our point of view, explanation be for the thing that became this miracle in the Bible?
Yeah, this is the fish and the bread.
The wine at Cana and so on. And I had a lot of fun with that. What I didn't want to do was portray Jesus in a way that was disrespectful to Christians. So Ishtanu doesn't know, even from his experience with Yeshu, even from his perspective of seeing the evolution of human thought over 3,200 years, if Christianity is true. He doesn't know if the resurrection happened. He doesn't rule it out, but he doesn't know. And I wanted to leave it that imprecise,
right?
So as not to push my secular narrative so far as to make it offensive to people whose
faith,
whose own belief system, whose own faith is Christian.
I thought that was one of the most powerful parts of the book, is that every religion as introduced by a character, just another character, Yeshu and everyone else, that really and truly it was open to this idea of the possibility of Hinduism being the faith, of Judaism being the faith, of Christianity being the faith, but leaving it open and acknowledging that that is what it is. Religion is not faith. Like they're not entrenched, right? One exists out of philosophers doing the work of philosophy, and faith exists out of this human need to believe in something outside of what we're living in from day to day. So I thought you did a great job.
Oh, thank you so
And even atheism and agnosticism. I think any reader who's going to pick up Call Me Stan is not going to feel alienated by the presentation of religion and the spirituality.
I certainly hope that's true. That was my goal.
Yeah, it was great. It was well done for me anyway.
Thank you.
I want to talk about comedy. There were some very, very many laugh out loud scenes. The circumcision scene, again, I don't know if that's because I identify female and I found that scene particularly funny, but it was just how each of those moments, the circumcision I'm using it as an example, how brilliantly you took Ishtanu through moments and didn't enact the comedy on the reader, if you know what I mean, like with the, ba-doom boom or whatever, but that the reader was left in that scene and other scenes feeling not like laughing at Ishtanu, but laughing at the moment. How did you approach writing the comedy in Call Me Stan? Because it really and truly is just very, very precise, but not on the nose.
Well, I think I have a pretty dry sense of humor, and I wanted to bring that to Stan. I very much wanted the historical bits to be anachronistic, not in what happened necessarily, but in the way Stan talks about them. So, there's a little bit of exposition about the 100 Years' War where Stan is kind of giving the background, and he says, I'm wildly paraphrasing again, but he says, when your king wakes up one morning, pops a bagel in the toaster and thinks, hey, maybe I should be king of France. I wanted that kind of anachronistic wryness to the way Stan told the story. And so that was probably the main motivating thing for me for how I would bring my own kind of cockeyed sense of humor to writing him.
Yeah, no, it was really great. And the voice, and I think it was evident to everybody that it's sort of a confessional monologue, first person narrative, where Ishtanu is talking to a police officer in present day. Was that always how you were going to tell the story? Is that how you knew Ishtanu was going to present? You talked about knowing it was going to be first person, but did you always know it was going to be that kind of confessional monologue?
I don't think I initially knew specifically that it would be he's being interviewed by the police about some initially unspecified crime. But what I absolutely did not want was just to have, here's a vignette, here's a vignette, here's a vignette, here's a vignette. There you go, reader. Here's a bunch of stuff. I really needed there to be some overarching connection that brought those historical sections together. And I don't even remember at what point in the process the idea of having him in a police interview room kind of emerged as the way I did that. But early enough on that I feel I was able to have that present day arc comment back on the historical stuff, and the historical stuff comment back on the present day stuff, in a way that I hope makes the book a unified whole, as opposed to the kind of series of fragments that it could have been.
Yeah, and I felt there was such a perfect balance between that, monologue where he uses modern day colloquialisms within the time 3,000 years ago, when we're seeing him living as a young man, when he in fact was a young man, that at first it was not jarring so much as just surprising. But then that adds to the comedy as well, just having him interact 2000 years ago with characters and using more modern day colloquial language. How did you feel when you were immersed in the narrative? Did you ever feel like you went off track and you started writing more, I use the word narratively, but that you were writing more writerly, I guess, as opposed to maintaining? Did you ever feel like you lost that confessional monologue tone?
Well, I think the confessional element of it is really the most prominent in the present day arc.
Mm-hmm.
So in the historical bits, even though there are kind of breaching the fourth wall asides to the interrogator from time to time,
Mm-hmm.
I really wrote those as almost standalone pieces, which I was then able to have interact with the present day stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I felt the need to make it quite so confessional in tone throughout those, because each of those sections has its own arc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't feel like I ever completely departed from that, but I don't think it needed to be as big an emphasis in those sections.
Yeah, no, I felt that, and that where this question was born was in reading parts of the story 2000 years ago, 1200 years ago, and thinking, I have forgotten that he's in a police station in Toronto in present day. And then the question as a reader is, am I supposed to remember that? Because this is just the kind of reader I am. I don't think it's necessarily how other readers would think, but in asking myself as a reader, am I supposed to remember that? Or am I supposed to be immersed in that era? And I think you've answered that question.
Yeah, I think each section was meant to be immersive on its own.
Yeah.
And then the present day narrative is just the thread that ties them together.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Allison, it's a 400-page book.
I know.
Everyone's going to lose track of something along the way. I had one reader who genuinely forgot, this is a bit spoilery, but genuinely forgot that William was not Ishtanu's biological son.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and that I wanted to talk to you about names. You brought William, because William wasn't William when Ishtanu, when he was introduced to Ishtanu and Nika. And Nika's name is mentioned in the acknowledgements, and you yourself mentioned coming up with Ishtanu's name in your recent blog. So I want to talk to you about names. I want to talk to you about how through reading the history in each one of the eras that are presented in the book, how you thought about the names. And I would love for you to talk about Nika's name. Sorry, I say Anika because that's part of the story, but
yeah,
talk about Nika's name and anyone else's name.
Well, why don't we do Nika's name for a start? And I'm just going to flip to the acknowledgements that you're talking about.
Yeah.
To make sure that I get it right.
Yeah.
I've done an enormous amount of reading about Buddhism over the course of my life, and I've been involved in a couple of Buddhist communities and done a lot of Buddhist sitting meditation on and off.
Mm-hmm.
So I had come upon this term Anicca, Anicca, in Buddhism, which is in the Pali language that is used in Buddhism, means impermanence. And impermanence is a huge idea in Buddhist thought, mm-hmm. that everything is impermanent, right down to the smallest particle. And that's a reality, but our conventional perceived existence is also an equally valid reality. So
Mhm.
I had this term anika, meaning impermanence, and I thought I'm going to knock off the a, which is what negatives makes it a negative, so that functionally it means permanence,
Mhm.
and give that name to the female character. And she approaches immortality and identity differently than Stan does.
Yeah.
He, as the opening says, changes his name all the time and tries to keep a common element. Nika is just always Nika. Like,
Mhm.
however long she's been alive, she just always goes by Nika. And so the idea that immortality is maybe sort of kind of a type of permanence. I mean,
Mhm.
if everything is impermanent, then no. But in conventional day-to-day reality, for these immortal people, yeah, it's permanence. And so it was sort of a cheeky way to name the character.
Yeah. And William is in fact Wilhelm, but
Yeah,
Nika
Willem.
and Ishtanu, yeah, Willem are advised to change his name because of what people will think he is. But are there other names of characters in the novel that stand out as names that you particularly put more thought into than others?
I was really careful to try to have names fit with their periods. So
Yeah.
I picked up a book about Hittite gods,
Mhm.
and every Hittite character in the book is named for a Hittite god. I don't know if Hittites would have named their children for their gods, but this was my only source of Hittite names.
Right.
And so they all have the names of Hittite gods. And Stan's childhood friend Halki, his father is a brewer,
Mhm.
and Halki is a god of, among other things, intoxication. Ishtanu's stepmother Lilwani is a villain of the piece, and Lilwani is some sort of evil goddess in the Hittite pantheon. So yeah, that was how I approached those names.
Mhm. And
Um,
me,
sorry,
no, go, keep going.
but the number of times I would have just Googled, you know, German given names, or whichever period I'm in. I try to make sure that the names were appropriate to the place and to the extent necessary at the time.
Hmm. Yeah. And Nika, I want to talk about Nika because she and Ishtanu, they fall madly in love. They spend a generation and a half together. But as you say, they see this immortality differently. Ishtanu doesn't want to hang around and see, he witnesses William die. He doesn't want to hang around and see his grandchildren live and get old and die. And Nika is so attached to family, she can't leave. And as we learn later on, stays for generations with the family. And that made me think, of course, as a person whose family is so important to her, that made me think how I would be as an immortal if I could stand to see that, or if I would want to escape like Ishtanu. And I want to know if you thought in writing this book about immortality and who you would be.
I don't know that I've quite gone to who would I be,
Yeah.
but I did really want to think through some of the implications of being immortal.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's where you get the thing that I read in the opening about you think you have a hard time remembering all your online passwords.
Yeah.
And there's another section, another little passage where he's addressing the police interrogator directly, and he says, imagine just having to give up everything you have, the instant noodles in your cupboard, like everything, and just start from scratch and build everything. Like, imagine having to do that over a course of lifetimes. So
yeah.
And the section in the 14th century in mostly England, with Stan and Nika and William, was the section where I really kind of bore down on, okay, close, loving human relationships. What do you do with those if you're immortal and everyone around you, or almost everyone around you, is mortal?
Yeah.
And I don't know that any of us can know what we would do in that situation, but I tried to use those two characters to explore two different kinds of approaches that people might take.
Yeah, there was such sadness when I was reading that section, that particular section, when William dies and Ishtanu makes the decision to leave. But I was leaning Nika in my own thoughts. But I want to invite anybody. I just have one more question, and I want to talk about the next novel. But if anyone has any questions for Kevin, please put them in the chat. You can direct them to Kaylee specifically, or you can just drop them in the chat, and she will ask on your behalf. So I wanted to talk about the Black Death. Pestilence shows up in the novel, and I wanted to talk to you. There's a couple of things that you mentioned in people's reactions to pestilence and what it means to the society. And I wanted to know if you were writing any of Call Me Stan during the pandemic, and if that played into.
I wasn't, actually.
No, yeah.
It's just a coincidence. Stan was accepted for publication in 2019, before the pandemic was even on the horizon.
Right.
But that seems to be happening. That I was at Word on the Street Festival last weekend, and the local author Victoria Hetherington has just published a book called Autonomy, which has a pandemic in the narrative. And she was one of the speakers at an event, at one of the panels at Word on the Street. And she made this point, she set that up before COVID.
Yeah.
But because of the timing of the publication, she's getting a reaction to the book like, I'm just so tired of reading pandemic fiction.
I know.
At least I think in my case, there's enough of a distinction between the Black Death and COVID that it's not as on the nose as writing about a pandemic in the present day or the near future would have been.
Right. And it's interesting how much fiction written pre-pandemic that you read that has that the plague or thoughts of a antibiotic resistant endemic or pandemic in it. And it's tiring to hear people say they're tired of hearing pandemic stories when there's just so much potential in it. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be the narrative that each of us have been living, but there's so much potential in living through a pandemic.
Well, what interested me about it was many years ago, I read a book about the Black Death, and what fascinated me more so than the disease itself was the knock-on effects to society.
Yeah.
Europe lost a third of its people. Workers gained an enormous amount of power, economic power, because there was such a scarcity of them. And so I went back and read some more about the Black Death, and then when I was reading about the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, that exact thing was happening, and the rulers tried to prevent it by sort of locking in wages at a pre-Black Death level that just was so unrealistic that there ended up being this massive peasants' revolt.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just found that tremendously interesting, and again, it was something I felt like I wanted to run with, and I did.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Kaylee, before I talk about the next novel, which I'm excited to talk about, do we have any questions?
We do. We have two. So our first question is from Anna, and Anna asks, Call Me Stan has many narrative elements. What genre do you think you've written in?
I don't know. I've seen it classified as literary fiction, and I hope it is. I think there are some who maybe find it too easy to read to characterize as literary fiction. Maybe I should go back and knock out all the quotation marks. Maybe that would push it over the line. I don't know. Some bookstores put it in general fictions. More commonly, they're putting it in science fiction. There seems to be a widespread misunderstanding that it's about time travel, which I think is part of why it's getting put in science fiction.
Right.
It's historical fiction, but it's weird historical fiction. So I don't think the historical fiction people are embracing it as part of their genre. So yeah, your guess is as good as mine.
I would say it's more literary than I mean, it's definitely not sci-fi. I would, if someone had asked me, I would have described it as literary fiction.
That's how I'd like to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
It's because we have an immortal narrator, it's sci-fi enough that the Baka Phoenix science fiction bookstore decided to stock it. So
right.
I'm good.
Well, I mean, if it gets you into Baka, then that's a good thing. Kaylee, any more questions?
Yeah, we have one more question from Marcia. And Marcia asks, as someone who does a lot of deep diving on Wikipedia and gets lost in research spirals, how did you keep yourself on track when researching for the book? Were there any particular topics that sucked you in more than others?
I think, not that I planned it this way, but I think just the way the writing developed and the way I used Wikipedia during the writing process kind of prevented that from happening, because I used printed books, paper books, as my resources. And then I would only go to Wikipedia, and I did it a lot, but I would only go to Wikipedia for details. So, for example, when I'm writing about Wagner in 19th century Switzerland, I'm writing a scene and I want there to be an upright piano. And I'm thinking, did they have upright pianos in Europe in the mid 19th century? I better look that up. So I go on Wikipedia and find out, yes, they did. But that's a very contained topic that didn't open up a rabbit hole for me to go down. There's a lengthy section that didn't make it into the final. Stan ends up in Zurich because he's with the French army, and there's a whole battle of Zurich, and the Russian Imperial Army is coming, and there's still a little bit of that sketched out almost as exposition, but there was a whole section involving a battle north of Zurich across a river, and I did a fair amount of research, including pulling up some line drawings from the time about what kind of pontoon boats the French army would have had at the time. Again, a contained enough topic that I didn't end up going down a rabbit hole. If I used Wikipedia as my primary source from the outset, that might have been a little more dangerous.
Right. And that you're really just checking in to make sure what you're writing isn't inaccurate or
yeah, and
completely
it's
implausible.
fiction, so there's a lot of stuff that's going to be inaccurate, but I wanted to make the effort to get those kinds of details correct.
Yeah. And Kaylee, any more? I want to talk about the next novel. I am excited that Ishtanu is going to exist in another story. What can you share? What do you want to share about the next novel and what the story is going to be?
Well, I'll avoid being spoilery about Call Me Stan and be a little bit vague. The narrative in Stan, it's all Stan. In the next book, it will be alternating narratives between Stan and another immortal character. I have, at least in draft, I think 4 sections written now. Well, 3 and most of a 4th. So I have Stan in the trenches of World War I fighting for Germany. I have the other character in the Mediterranean, in an idiosyncratic retelling of parts of the Odyssey.
Oh, wow.
I have Stan, and this one's tricky. I have a draft and I have a lot that I need to do with it, because I want to treat serious things seriously, but I also don't want to lose the humor that I think is an important part of Stan's story. But I have Stan. There was this connection in Western culture between Wagner and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. They were really close friends, and then they fell out. And I've just been a little fascinated with Nietzsche in the same way that I've been fascinated by Wagner. I'm not a Wagnerian, I'm not a Nietzschean, but interesting guys. And Nietzsche had this profound psychological break and ended up institutionalized in what was called a clinic for the insane, I think, or words to that effect at the time, in the city of Jena in Germany. So I'm putting Stan in that clinic with Nietzsche at that time. Wow. Which painfully meant I had to read a lot of Nietzsche, but I have a draft of that, and we'll see how I'm able to walk that line between, treating mental illness with the seriousness and respect that it requires, and still finding ways to maintain the humor. And maybe most of the humor has to come from other sections that Stan is in. I don't know. I mean, not all of the section about the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt is humorous. Maybe that's the
that's the brilliance of creating an immortal character, is that you can't fit 3,300 years in 400 pages, and so we have to have more, which makes me happy.
Very kind of you. Yeah.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to give a special thank you to you for joining us on so many occasions at Junction Reads and supporting other authors who've joined us throughout the season. And I'm excited that, I keep using the word excited, I'm very happy that we got to finish off our season with you today. Thank you so much.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for including me.
I really appreciate that. We are going to raffle off 2 copies of Call Me Stan from Guernica Editions. And Kaylee, I'll pass it over to you.
Yay, very exciting. And I feel like, Kevin, you were on a good streak. You had a good lucky streak, but today...
Yeah, don't put my name in.
Yeah, you can't win today.
I have a feeling you've read the book already. Our first winner for today is Jean Shepherd. Congratulations to Jean.
Jean Shepherd has read the book too, because she's my wife.
Oh, there you go. Well, so you can nominate somebody, Kevin, if you want to nominate someone to gift the book to, I'm happy to send
I'm
Michael.
gonna leave that up to Jean. She's the one who won the book.
There you go.
Amazing. I think I always have magic fingers. I always manage to pull people's partners, and they're like, "Yeah, my partner's already read the book." I'm like,
Right.
"Okay."
Or a mother. We pulled a mother once.
We pulled a
yeah.
mother once, yeah. All right, and our second winner for today is Rosalie Camacho, and I believe she had to leave just at 6, so we will reach out to her via email, and we'll get her book to her. But congratulations to Jean and to Rosalie.
Yay. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. It's truly appreciated, and the support of everyone who's watching this video posted after the event. Your support is also appreciated. Please follow us at junctionreads.ca. We will be posting some more information about next season. We will have a hybrid, fingers crossed, we're back at the Anansi Bookshop and live streaming, and also having events like this with authors from across Canada, maintaining our accessibility, which has become very important to us. And that is it. That is all. I wish you all the best for a great summer. Thank you, Kaylee, as always, and incredible support. And always here to make sure that the technical stuff doesn't go as awful as it did at the beginning. Again, apologies for that. Kevin, thank you so much, and best of luck writing the next novel.
Oh, thanks, Allison. I'm pleased that you're looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye.
Bye all.